There is a weapon sitting on trailers at an American base right now that the United States has never once fired in combat, in any war, against any enemy, anywhere on Earth. Not because it isn't ready, because until this exact moment in this exact war, nobody has needed it badly enough to actually pull the trigger. It travels at more than 5 times the speed of sound. It can change direction mid-flight, which means it does not fly the predictable arc that every existing missile defense system on the planet was built to track and intercept. And it can reach targets more than 1,700 miles away. Some analysts say considerably farther, in a matter of minutes rather than hours. Its name is Dark Eagle, and the United States Central Command has now formally asked the Pentagon to send it into this war against Iran. If that request is approved, it would mark the first time in American history that a hypersonic weapon has actually been fired at a real enemy in a real war rather than a test range. This is not internet speculation about some secret future weapon. This is a confirmed, formally submitted request currently sitting in front of Pentagon leadership, reported by Bloomberg, Fox News, and multiple other outlets specifically covering exactly this decision. Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because I am going to walk you through exactly what this missile is, why the Pentagon suddenly needs it in this specific conflict, why serious defense experts are split on whether it will actually work as advertised, and why Iran's own recent claims about surviving a hypersonic strike from a different country entirely complicate the simple story that this weapon is unstoppable. Here is the detail that should stop you before we go any further. This request did not come from a desire to show off new technology. It came from a specific, confirmed operational gap. American commanders discovered that Iran had moved its ballistic missile launchers beyond the reach of the weapon the U.S. had been using to hit them, or the Army's precision strike missile, which tops out at around 300 miles. Dark Eagle was requested specifically to close that gap, reaching targets that every other weapon currently in the American arsenal in this theater simply cannot touch. Let's break down exactly what this missile is and exactly how far the reality matches the hype. Before I go further, here is where I am coming from on this. I have spent years around military weapon systems and strike operations, including how a program like this moves from a test range to an actual request for combat use, which is exactly the lens I am bringing to this story. Everything you are about to hear is drawn from confirmed program details, official statements, and reporting from outlets that specialize in tracking exactly this kind of weapons development. I will tell you clearly what has been tested and confirmed, what remains genuinely uncertain, and where the real skepticism inside the defense community actually lives. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. Let's start with what this weapon actually is, because the technical details matter enormously here. Officially designated the Long-Range Hypersonic Weapon, or LRHW, and nicknamed Dark Eagle, this is the United States Army's first land-based hypersonic missile system. It uses a 2-stage rocket booster to launch what is called a Common Hypersonic Glide Body to the edge of the atmosphere, at which point the glide body separates and descends toward its target at speeds exceeding Mach 5, more than 5 times the speed of sound, while maneuvering along the way rather than following the fixed, predictable arc of a traditional ballistic missile. That maneuverability is the entire point. Existing missile defense systems, whether Patriot batteries, THAAD, or ship-based Aegis interceptors, are largely built around calculating where a threat will be based on its trajectory shortly after launch. A weapon that can change course mid-flight at hypersonic speed dramatically compresses the amount of time any defensive system has to react, and in many scenarios may not give it enough time to react at all. It helps to understand exactly why that mid-flight maneuverability creates such a fundamentally different problem for missile defense than a traditional ballistic missile does. A conventional ballistic missile follows a predictable parabolic arc once its booster phase ends, similar in principle to a thrown ball following gravity, which means a defender who detects the launch early enough can calculate roughly where that missile will be at any given moment along its flight, and position an interceptor to meet it there. A hypersonic glide vehicle breaks that entire assumption. Because it can adjust its flight path throughout its descent, a defender cannot simply calculate one fixed future position and wait. They have to continuously reacquire and recalculate the target's position throughout the engagement window, all while the missile itself is closing the remaining distance at several times the speed of sound. That combination, extreme speed plus in-flight unpredictability, is precisely why this entire category of weapon has become the focus of such intense investment from every major military power over the past decade. Lockheed Martin serves as the primary contractor integrating the overall system, while Sandia National Laboratories developed the glide body itself in partnership with the Navy, and Aerojet Rocketdyne provides the propulsion. The launcher itself is a substantial piece of equipment, mounted on a trailer towed by a heavy expanded mobility tactical truck, with each launcher carrying 2 missiles, and a full battery consisting of 4 launchers, carrying 8 missiles total, alongside the necessary support equipment. That entire battery, according to figures reported by defense trade outlets, costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.7 billion, with each individual missile priced at roughly $15 million, though some estimates put the true cost considerably higher once the full research and development investment is factored in. This is not a mass-produced weapon meant to be fired in large numbers. It is an extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily precise tool meant for a very specific category of target. Heavily defended, time-sensitive assets that nothing else in the arsenal can reliably reach or hit quickly enough. Put those cost figures in perspective for a moment, because they explain a great deal about how sparingly a weapon like this would actually be used, even if fully approved for this conflict. At roughly $15 million per missile, a single Dark Eagle costs multiple times more than most of the precision munitions, already being used extensively throughout this war. A single battery's full complement of 8 missiles represents a finite, carefully rationed inventory, not an unlimited supply that could simply be fired at every hardened or mobile target Iran possesses. That scarcity is itself a strategic factor. This weapon, if used at all, would almost certainly be reserved for the small handful of targets judged important enough and inaccessible enough by any other means to justify committing one of these extraordinarily expensive missiles to a single strike. I need to ask something of you before we go further into this, because a story involving a weapon this technically complex, with this much genuine disagreement among experts about whether it actually works as advertised, deserves careful tracking, rather than a single dramatic headline glance. If you want the full breakdown as this deployment decision develops, subscribe and turn on notifications now. I am following every credible update on this weapon in real time. Now, let's talk about exactly why the Pentagon suddenly needs this specific weapon in this specific war, because the operational logic here is genuinely revealing. U.S. Central Command's formal request, submitted through what is known as a request for forces, laid out a very specific justification. American intelligence had determined that Iran had relocated its ballistic missile launchers beyond the range of the Army's existing precision strike missile, a supersonic surface-to-surface weapon that can hit targets out to roughly 300 miles, and in some reporting, closer to 500 kilometers. Iran, in other words, adapted. Rather than keeping its mobile launchers within range of the weapons the United States had already been using to hunt them, Iranian forces pulled them back deeper into the country's interior, betting that distance alone would provide meaningful protection against continued American strikes. Dark Eagle, with a reported range exceeding 1,700 miles, some analysts citing figures closer to 2,200 miles under certain conditions, was specifically requested to close exactly that gap, reaching deep into Iranian territory that had, until this request, become a genuine sanctuary for exactly the kind of mobile missile assets this war has spent months trying to hunt down and destroy. That adaptation by Iran deserves a moment of real credit, strategically speaking, even from the American side of this conflict. Recognizing that your mobile assets are vulnerable within a specific range band and systematically repositioning them just beyond that range is a coherent, low-cost countermeasure that does not require Iran to develop any new technology of its own. It simply requires understanding the limitations of the weapons being used against you and exploiting the geography available. That Iran successfully executed this adaptation well enough to force the United States into requesting an entirely different, far more expensive category of weapon just to restore its previous reach, says something important about how adaptive this conflict has become on both sides, well beyond the simple narrative of overwhelming American technological superiority steamrolling a hopelessly outmatched adversary. Here's a detail that should genuinely change how you think about the scale of what is being discussed. During a public briefing, Lieutenant General Francisco Lozano, the Army's Director of Hypersonic, Directed Energy, Space, and Rapid Acquisition Programs, told Defense Secretary Hegseth directly that the system's range is significant enough that it could reach mainland China from Guam. That is not a comment about Iran specifically. It is a comment about the broader strategic scale of this weapon, one originally developed with an eye toward countering China's own rapidly advancing hypersonic arsenal in the Pacific, not built from the ground up with Iran in mind at all. The fact that this Pacific-oriented, China-focused weapon is now being requested for a war against Iran tells you just how significant the specific problem of Iran's relocated launchers has become, serious enough to justify pulling one of the Army's most strategically sensitive and limited inventory weapon systems out of its intended theater and into an entirely different conflict. That kind of redirection is not a decision the Army makes casually. Every Dark Eagle battery pulled toward the Middle East is a battery unavailable for whatever contingency it was originally positioned to deter in the Pacific. The exact same kind of trade-off discussed elsewhere in this war, regarding aircraft carriers and other high-demand, low-density assets. The Army possesses only a limited number of these batteries, each one representing years of development and billions of dollars of investment. which means committing even a single battery to this specific conflict represents a meaningful, deliberate reallocation of a genuinely scarce strategic resource, not a routine deployment decision made without real weight behind it. Let's talk about the track record this weapon actually has, because this is where the story becomes genuinely more complicated than a simple game-changer narrative. Dark Eagle completed a series of successful tests in 2024, and footage has since emerged showing the missile mounted on a B-1 bomber for the first time, a clear signal the Air Force is exploring integrating hypersonic weapons onto its bomber fleet, as well as the Army's ground-launched configuration. An unnamed defense official told Fox News the system has reached what the military calls initial operational capability, technically meaning it is available for potential use. And it has already seen limited forward deployment once before, when soldiers brought the system to Australia's Northern Territory in July of last year as part of Exercise Talisman Sabre, marking its first operational employment anywhere outside the continental United States, though that deployment remained a training and deterrence exercise rather than anything resembling actual combat use. That Australia deployment is worth understanding in a bit more detail, because it represents the closest this weapon has come to real-world operational conditions prior to this current request. Soldiers from the unit assigned to Dark Eagle, part of the 5th Battalion, 3rd Field Artillery Regiment, transported and set up the entire launch system on the other side of the planet from its home base, demonstrating that the logistics of actually moving and operating this equipment in a forward location were achievable, even if no missile was actually fired during that specific exercise. That distinction matters. Successfully transporting and positioning a weapon system is a meaningfully different achievement than successfully firing it under real combat conditions against an actively defended target. And the gap between those two milestones is exactly what a potential deployment to the Middle East would finally close, one way or another. Here's the hard truth, and I think this is where a lot of the breathless coverage of this weapon gets it wrong. The program has also been plagued by years of delays, missed deadlines, and real technical setbacks. The Army has publicly acknowledged it would not meet its original timeline for early deployment, and the missile has reportedly failed to launch during multiple tests due to launcher and production quality issues. Even more significantly, the Pentagon's own independent testing office, the group specifically responsible for objectively evaluating whether a weapon actually performs as claimed, has stated it will not have enough data to properly evaluate Dark Eagle's combat effectiveness until early 2027. Read that carefully. The people inside the Pentagon whose entire job is to assess whether this weapon genuinely works are saying they cannot yet confirm that it does, even as Central Command is actively requesting to fire it in a real war against a real adversary right now. That timeline gap is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a small discrepancy. A request to use this weapon in actual combat is being considered right now, in the middle of this year, while the office responsible for independently verifying its combat effectiveness says it will not have sufficient data to make that assessment until roughly a year from now at the earliest. That means any decision to approve this deployment would necessarily be made without the benefit of the Pentagon's own rigorous independent evaluation process, relying instead on the more limited test data available so far, and the operational judgment of commanders eager to close a real capability gap in an active war. That is not necessarily an irrational decision. Wartime necessity regularly forces exactly this kind of trade-off between speed and certainty, but it is a genuinely different situation than a weapon being fielded only after its full evaluation process has run its complete course. That gap between operational request and independent verification has not gone unnoticed by defense analysts watching this story closely. Kelly Grieco, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, offered a pointed and specifically cynical read on the timing of this request, noting publicly that the push to deploy a not yet fully operational hypersonic missile against Iran happened to arrive during the exact season when the Pentagon builds its next defense budget request to Congress, suggesting that demonstrating a dramatic first combat use could help secure additional funding for the program going forward. That is not a claim that the weapon does not work. It is a reminder that the timing and framing of exactly when and how a weapons system gets its combat debut is never purely a battlefield decision. It is also, always, a decision shaped by institutional and budgetary incentives inside the Pentagon itself, a dynamic worth keeping in mind every time a brand new weapon gets described publicly as a game changer right as budget season begins. Let's talk about the title of this video directly, because the claim that Iran has no defense against this weapon deserves honest scrutiny rather than simply being repeated as fact. It is true that hypersonic glide vehicles are fundamentally harder to intercept than traditional ballistic missiles, because their maneuverability during flight defeats the basic assumption most existing missile defense systems are built around, predicting a fixed trajectory early and positioning an interceptor to meet it. Multiple independent research analyses, including studies specifically examining hypersonic threats, have concluded that the speed, maneuverability, and flight profile of these weapons make them genuinely difficult for current American missile defense systems like THAAD, Patriot PAC-3, and Aegis interceptors to reliably counter. That difficulty, however, cuts in more than one direction. And this is where the story gets more complicated than a simple one-sided claim of invulnerability. It is worth being precise about what Iran's own air defense inventory actually consists of, before drawing conclusions about whether it could plausibly counter a weapon like Dark Eagle. Iran's layered air defense network includes Russian-supplied S-300 systems and domestically produced platforms like the Bavar 373, systems designed primarily to counter aircraft and more conventional ballistic missile threats, rather than a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle specifically. None of Iran's currently known air defense assets have been publicly assessed by independent defense analysts as having a demonstrated reliable capability against hypersonic threats specifically, which is precisely the gap in capability that makes a weapon like Dark Eagle attractive to plan around in the first place. That absence of a proven Iranian countermeasure is a genuinely different claim than saying no defense against this category of weapon exists anywhere, a distinction that matters enormously for how confidently this video's title should actually be taken at face value. Iran itself has publicly claimed to possess a hypersonic weapon of its own called Fateh-2, and Iranian officials asserted earlier this year that some of these missiles successfully evaded American-made THAAD missile defense systems deployed to protect Israel during a wave of strikes in early March. Those specific claims have not been independently verified by neutral sources, and skepticism toward Iranian weapons claims has a long history given past exaggerated announcements from Tehran about its missile programs. But the broader point stands regardless of whether Iran's specific claims about that particular engagement hold up under scrutiny. The fundamental interception challenge posed by hypersonic, maneuverable weapons is not unique to American technology facing Iranian defenses. It cuts the other way just as much, meaning any American hypersonic weapon deployed against Iran would be entering a conflict where the basic vulnerability of existing missile defense technology to exactly this category of threat has already been publicly demonstrated, at least according to Iran's own claims, from the opposite direction. Let's zoom out to the broader global picture here, because Dark Eagle's combat debut, if it happens, would not occur in a vacuum. Russia has fired its Kinzhal hypersonic missile against Ukraine nearly 100 times over the course of that war, with most of those weapons intercepted by American-made Patriot systems or defeated through Ukrainian electronic warfare, evidence that even genuine hypersonic weapons can, in at least some real-world conditions, be countered by sufficiently capable air defense, contrary to the absolute framing that hypersonic weapons are simply unstoppable by definition. China has fielded its own operational hypersonic systems as well, and has been rapidly advancing this category of weapons, specifically as a way to counter America's traditional naval and air dominance in the Pacific. The United States, despite investing heavily in hypersonic research for years, has never actually fired one of its own hypersonic weapons in combat, a gap that has become an increasingly visible embarrassment relative to both of its primary strategic competitors, and part of why some analysts believe using Dark Eagle in this specific lower-stakes conflict against Iran, rather than waiting for a potential future confrontation with a far more capable adversary, represents an attractive opportunity to finally close that combat experience gap under conditions the Pentagon considers more forgiving of any potential failure. That Kinzhal track record deserves particular attention, because it is the single most extensively combat-tested hypersonic weapon in the world right now, and its actual performance record complicates any simple story about hypersonic weapons being categorically unstoppable. If a purpose-built, extensively combat-proven Russian hypersonic missile can be intercepted by American-supplied Patriot batteries under real wartime conditions in Ukraine, that is a meaningful data point, suggesting that layered, well-resourced air defense can, at least some of the time, successfully counter even genuine hypersonic threats. Whether Iran's own air defense network, considerably less sophisticated and more degraded after months of sustained strikes throughout this war, would perform anywhere near as well against an incoming Dark Eagle is a separate and much more uncertain question, but the Kinzhal record itself is a useful reminder that hypersonic does not automatically mean guaranteed, unstoppable success in every single engagement, regardless of which side is firing the weapon. That framing deserves its own moment of scrutiny because it reveals something important about why Iran specifically may have been chosen as the theater for this weapon's combat debut. Testing an unproven, extraordinarily expensive weapon system in actual combat carries real risk of public failure, and a war against Iran, however serious and costly it has already proven to be, represents a considerably lower stakes environment for that kind of test than a hypothetical future confrontation with a peer adversary like China or Russia would. If Dark Eagle underperforms against Iranian targets, the strategic consequences, while still serious, remain contained to this specific conflict. If a similar failure happened during an actual crisis with a nuclear-armed peer competitor, the consequences would be immeasurably more severe. That calculation, whether or not it was explicitly stated in Central Command's formal request, is very likely part of why this particular war has become the venue chosen for the weapon's first real combat test. Let's talk about what actually happens if this weapon does get approved and used, because the operational picture here is significant beyond the missile itself. Dark Eagle is specifically designed to strike what military planners call high-value, time-sensitive targets, hardened installations, mobile missile launchers caught in the open, air defense systems, and command and control centers. Exactly the category of targets that has proven hardest to hit throughout this entire war, because Iran has repeatedly relocated and hidden them faster than slower or shorter-range American weapons could respond. A missile that can reach nearly anywhere inside Iranian territory within minutes of a launch order, while maneuvering unpredictably along the way, would meaningfully compress the amount of warning time Iranian forces have to move a detected launcher before a strike arrives, directly undermining the exact relocate and hide strategy that has kept many of Iran's mobile assets alive through months of American strikes so far. Think about how that compressed timeline actually changes the tactical picture on the ground. Throughout this war, Iran's mobile missile batteries have survived largely by exploiting the gap between when American surveillance detects them and when a strike weapon can actually arrive. A window that, with existing shorter range or slower munitions, has often been long enough for a launcher to relocate before it can be hit. A weapon that closes that window down to minutes, rather than the hour or more a slower system might require, fundamentally shrinks the margin Iranian crews have historically relied on to survive detection. That compression, more than the raw destructive power of any single missile, is arguably the more consequential tactical shift a weapon like Dark Eagle could introduce into this specific conflict, assuming it performs as designed under real combat conditions. Here is where I want to bring genuine balance back into this breakdown, because a weapon's theoretical capability and its actual battlefield performance are not automatically the same thing. Even setting aside the Pentagon's own testing office and its stated need for more data before 2027, deploying any weapon system for the first time in real combat conditions rather than a controlled test range introduces variables that simply cannot be fully accounted for in advance. Extreme heat, sandstorms from electronic warfare, interference from an adversary actively trying to jam or spoof the system, and the simple reality that combat conditions are messier and less predictable than even the most rigorous test environment. Multiple defense analysts covering this story have specifically cautioned against treating Dark Eagle as an automatic game changer, pointing to its limited numbers, extraordinarily high per unit cost, and total lack of prior combat testing as reasons it is more likely to provide a genuine tactical advantage against specific, hard-to-reach targets than to single-handedly transform the broader trajectory of this war. That distinction between a genuine tactical advantage and a war-ending single-weapon transformation matters enormously for how you should actually interpret a title promising this missile can end wars in seconds. No single weapon, however advanced, has ever single-handedly ended a modern war through its own capability alone. Wars end through a combination of sustained military pressure, economic exhaustion, diplomatic negotiation, and political decisions, made by leadership on both sides, not through any single munition, however fast or however difficult to intercept. What a weapon like Dark Eagle can realistically do, if it performs as intended, is remove one specific category of Iranian sanctuary: mobile launchers positioned just beyond the reach of existing American weapons, forcing Tehran to either accept greater risk to those assets or find yet another adaptation to preserve them. That is a genuinely significant tactical development. It is not, on its own, the kind of instantly war-ending capability the more sensational framing of this story tends to suggest. Let's bring this back to the bigger strategic picture, because a first-ever combat use of an American hypersonic weapon carries consequences that reach well beyond this specific war with Iran. Every government watching this conflict, particularly Beijing and Moscow, both of which have already fielded, and in Russia's case extensively combat-tested their own hypersonic systems, will be studying exactly how Dark Eagle performs if it is actually used, whether it hits its intended target, whether Iranian or Allied air defense is managed to track or disrupt it in any way, and whether the extraordinary cost per missile translates into a proportional battlefield advantage, or turns out to be a very expensive demonstration of a capability that still needs considerably more development before it becomes reliably combat ready. That is precisely why this decision has drawn attention from defense analysts far beyond anyone specifically focused on the Iran conflict itself. This is not simply a story about one missile and one war. It is a story about whether the United States can finally close a meaningful gap in the global hypersonic arms race that has defined military competition between major powers for the past several years, and whether it can do so under the genuine pressure of a live, ongoing conflict rather than the controlled conditions of a test range. There's a particular kind of scrutiny reserved for a weapon's very first combat use that does not apply to its 100th or its 1000th. Every subsequent use of a proven weapon gets measured against an established track record, but a debut engagement carries disproportionate symbolic weight, regardless of how representative that single outcome actually is of the weapon's true long-term reliability. If Dark Eagle performs flawlessly in its first real engagement, that success will be cited for years as proof the program's long, expensive development was worth it. If it fails, whether through a technical malfunction, a missed target, or an unexpectedly successful Iranian countermeasure, that single failure will likely dominate the public narrative around this weapon regardless of what additional testing eventually shows about its broader reliability. That asymmetry, where a single data point carries outsized narrative weight in either direction, is part of why this specific decision has become such a closely watched moment across the entire global defense community, not just among people specifically following the war in Iran. 2 things before you go, and I want you to actually do them. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer, more balanced picture of a weapon that has been covered by a lot of outlets in purely game-changer terms, share it with someone trying to understand how this war is actually evolving on the technology side, not just the battlefield side. Second, I want your honest read in the comments. Do you think Dark Eagle actually gets approved and used against Iran in the coming weeks? Or does the Pentagon's own testing office skepticism, combined with the program's history of delays, keep this specific weapon on the shelf a while longer? And given Iran's own claims about its Fatah-2 hypersonic missile evading American-made defenses earlier this year, do you think the idea that Iran has no defense against a weapon like this is accurate? Or does the deeper story here show that hypersonic weapons are difficult to stop in general, regardless of which country is firing them? I'm also curious whether you think using an unproven weapon in a real war, specifically because the stakes feel lower here than a future confrontation with China or Russia, is a responsible way to finally close America's hypersonic combat experience gap, or whether that logic troubles you given what is actually being risked. Drop your answer below. I read every one of them, and if this delivered real value, hit like before you go. Here's where this leaves us. U.S. Central Command has formally requested to deploy the Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic missile to the Middle East for potential use against Iran, a weapon capable of striking targets more than 1,700 miles away at speeds exceeding Mach 5 while maneuvering unpredictably in flight, specifically requested because Iran successfully moved its ballistic missile launchers beyond the range of every other weapon currently available to American forces in this theater. If approved, it would mark the first time in history that the United States has fired a hypersonic weapon in actual combat, a milestone that carries strategic significance reaching far beyond this specific war, watched closely by China and Russia as both a demonstration of American capability and a real-world test of a weapon that Washington has invested in for years without ever actually using it. At the same time, the Pentagon's own independent testing office says it will not have enough data to properly evaluate this weapon's combat effectiveness until early 2027. The program has a documented history of delays and failed test launches, and at least one respected defense analyst has publicly questioned whether budget cycle incentives are shaping the timing of this specific request as much as genuine battlefield necessity. Iran's own claims about its Fatah-2 missile evading American defenses earlier this year further complicate the simple narrative that hypersonic weapons are simply unstoppable in one direction only. No final decision had been publicly confirmed as of the most recent reporting on this request, which means the honest answer to whether this weapon actually gets used remains genuinely open. Whether Dark Eagle ultimately proves to be the decisive precision tool its designers intended, or an extraordinarily expensive weapon still not fully ready for the demands of real combat, the decision to test it for the first time in this specific war will shape how the world understands American hypersonic capability for years to come. Keep watching this one closely, because how this weapon performs, if it is used at all, may end up mattering as much for the future global balance of power as it does for the outcome of this specific conflict with Iran.